Evening, everyone. My name is Donna Walker-Kuhn. I am Senior Advisor for Community Engagement here at New Jersey Performing Arts Center. We are delighted to welcome all of you to tonight's wonderful discussion. We are going to be discussing the film, Policing the Police, with an esteemed panel that will really be examining police reform. What do we think our police perhaps can be doing? And what does the community think about this? We have a dynamic panel that includes a police captain, a victim of over-policing, and community leaders. And so I wanted to share a bit about our series, the PSEG True Diversity Film Series. We started this specific social justice initiative over the summer, and we did it with the purpose of bringing our community together and to encourage everyone to take part in this movement to ensure civil rights for all. So we launched this series of events that really focus on promoting racial equality and uprooting systemic racism. We focused on voter registration, census completion, and then tonight, of course, we're going to be talking about policing the police. We also are happy to have our advisors that support us, which are the Newark NAACP and the New Jersey Institute for Social Justice. We thank them for their great guidance as well. I'd like to take this moment to do our land acknowledgement. So we are gathered on the unceded land of the Lenape peoples. And I ask you to join me in acknowledging the Lenape community, their elders, both past and present, as well as future generations. We must also acknowledge that the grounds NJPAC stands upon were founded upon exclusions and erasures of the voices of many indigenous and oppressed people. We acknowledge that the teaching of U.S. history in schools, cultural institutions, and the media have left out many voices and difficult truths in order to create an idealized nation, nationalistic identity. We acknowledge the struggles of oppressed peoples, those actively and behind the scenes working to make our country honor its guiding principles of equality, liberty, and justice for all. We acknowledge and honor that Black lives matter. This acknowledgement demonstrates our commitment as a community working to dismantle the ongoing legacies of colonialism, oppression, and systemic racism. So before we introduce this amazing panel we have assembled for tonight, please help me welcome Rick Victon from PSEG, our corporate sponsors for the film series. Rick is Senior VP Corporate Citizenship and Chairman of the PSEG Foundation. He's responsible for areas of the business that drive public policy through advocacy, including federal, state, and local government affairs, sustainability, charitable activities, and corporate social responsibilities. Rick is very active in a number of organizations, including being a board member of the Regional Plan Association, the New Jersey Climate Change Alliance, and the New Jersey Legislative Black Caucus Foundation. Thank you, Rick. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you, Donna, and good evening, everyone. And you are in for an exciting evening, and it's really a privilege to be here representing public service, as well as being a partner with NJPAC on the True Diversity Film Series. And tonight is going to be just another example of how important that film series is and how much our commitment to Newark means to the corporation, as well as really our commitment to the whole state of New Jersey. As we all remember, in May of this year, George Floyd was killed by police officers. And there is no doubt that policing the police and the issues of public safety really are at the core of making our democracy greater. And public service is proud to announce that it has also started, in the wake of that killing, a Powering Equity and Social Justice initiative. And our first grant was to the Rutgers Center on Policing to really modernize, to help modernize and improve police practices and police interactions with all the communities in New Jersey, because public safety is such an essential part of making our state great and giving everybody the chance to live the lives that they deserve. And it's also worth mentioning for all of you who've been to Washington, D.C., and you go to the United States Supreme Court, which sits across First Avenue from the United States Capitol, and notice those little words across the entrance to the United States Supreme Court of equal justice under law. And the Supreme Court calls that the highest aspirations of American justice. So I can't think of a more important conversation to have than to have our police be a part of administering equal justice to all Americans. So I'm really excited about this exciting panel tonight. And it's now my job to introduce a very special guest, because we are especially delighted to welcome an award-winning journalist and writer, Jelani Cobb, who chronicles his years reporting on the Newark police in the documentary Policing the Police, which we've all watched in advance of tonight's discussion. Professor Cobb is the Ira A. Littman Professor of Journalism at Columbia University. He is the recipient of the 2015 Sidney Hillman Award for Opinion and Analysis Writing, and writes frequently about race, politics, and history, and our culture. He is the author of The Substance of Hope, Barack Obama and the Paradox of Progress, as well as To the Break of Dawn, a freestyle on the hip hop aesthetic. His articles and essays have appeared in the Washington Post. It is now my privilege to introduce our special guest, Mr. Jelani Cobb.
Thank you, Rick. I'm very happy to be here with you all this evening. I'm particularly happy to be able to introduce this film. I'll tell you a little bit about how we got started on this project, and hopefully this can frame some of the conversation that's about to happen around it. 5 years ago, two producers from Frontline, Anya Borg and James Jacoby, reached out to me to talk about policing and police reform. I'd written a series of articles on the subject, most centrally about Ferguson, where I'd visited multiple times. And they were interested in looking at the process of how you reform a police department. And through that became a collaboration that led to the first film, which was Policing the Police. And we started looking at what Newark was doing. We're interested in Newark for lots of reasons, not the least of which was that Newark has the shadow of 1967 has unfairly, in many ways, hung over the city for decades since. And we wanted to talk about how a city tackles the problems of a police department that needs to have reforms and builds a better rapport and relationship with the community that it serves. And we were also interested in following the mayor, Ras Baraka, as he went around in an effort to craft a new kind of relationship between his police department and his city. And that first film came out, and we spent a lot of time in Newark, and we observed a lot, and we met a lot of interesting people, but we were looking at the very beginning of the process. And there's only so much that we could say because it was, very much at the onset, the process of police reform. And then this summer, May 25th, actually, to be exact, we saw the death of George Floyd, that horrific moment that has been really blazed into all of our memories. And like many other people, we began having conversations about what this meant and the bigger context that his death occurred in. And we thought this would be a good time to revisit Newark, to come back 4 years later, to look at what's happened since we were there the last time, to follow up on people we had talked to before, and to approach some people that we hadn't gotten to talk to the first time, and to present a picture, maybe even a kind of before and after snapshot. So we're very proud of the work that we did there. We're very proud to be able to show a story of progress and change over time. And we're particularly grateful, I should say, for the access that the community gave us. The police officers were very open and frank with us. Anthony Ambrose, the public safety director, Mayor Ras Baraka, Aqeela Sherrills, so many people. I hope I haven't left anybody out, but we really got the opportunity to delve deeply into this issue and talk substantively about how you change a police department. We are at a moment where this is only going to become a more prominent part of our conversations in terms of public policy, in terms of our questions about crime prevention, in terms of our questions about what exactly it takes to create a safe city and what that is defined by. And since George Floyd, we've seen Kenosha, we've seen Atlanta, we've seen the recurring concerns in Louisville around Breonna Taylor. We've seen too many places to actually name right now. And our hope in creating this film, certainly the hope of many people who are advocating for police reform, is that there'll be a day when there no longer are any of these stories to tell. So in that light, that was the spirit that animated, making this film. And in that light, we'd like to thank you very much for everyone who supported, everyone who's watched it, and everyone who's about to participate in this conversation. And so I'll end there and give it back to Donna.
Thank you very much. Thank you very, very much. And so now it's my pleasure to introduce our moderators so we can get our panel started. Our moderator for this evening is Will Simpson. And in the fall of 2018, Will Simpson joined the team of Equal Justice USA as senior strategist. And in this role, he works with communities around the country, building healing responses to trauma and addressing racial equity through organizing and advocacy. And prior to joining Equal Justice USA, William was the director of My Brother's Keeper Newark, where he worked to create policy changes to increase life outcomes for boys and men of color. William is born, raised, and a current resident of Newark, New Jersey, and a Morehouse College alum. He serves on the board of directors of Glassroots Incorporated here in Newark, and we are delighted to have you this evening, Will. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much, Donna. And I want to say thank you to both you and Jelani for really framing tonight's conversation. And I also want to thank PSEG and NJPAC for creating this space and other important spaces to have this conversation and to really work on how we really come together to dismantle white supremacy and systemic racism here in the city of Newark. As Donna said, my name is William Simpson, Senior Strategist with Equal Justice USA. I'm really honored to be here tonight to hold this container for this conversation with an amazing group of leaders, visionaries, and really healers, right? But before we start, I want to acknowledge the weight of tonight's conversation, right? These are not easy topics to talk about. We see on TV every day Black bodies that have been harmed due to violence, whether it be state violence or community violence. And it's important that we do everything that we need to do, panelists and participants included, to practice self-care and to acknowledge the traumas that we all face and do what we need to do to create healing for ourselves, but more broadly, create healing for our communities. So without further ado, right, I wanna go ahead and start welcoming our panelists. Our first panelist is Professor Linda McDonald Carter, Esquire, Director of Paralegal Studies at Essex County College. Linda, can you give us a wave? There we go. I see you. How are you? Good, good, good. Second, we've got Colonel Patrick Callahan, Colonel of the New Jersey State Police. Colonel, are you there? Excellent. Great to have you this evening. Also, we've got Aqeela Sherrills. Aqeela is an international peace activist, as well as the board chair for the Newark Community Street Team. And last, but certainly not least, we have Jason Maurice Dotson, project manager at Newark's Pride Center and licensed clinical therapist. Hey, everybody, I'm glad you're with us. Good to see everybody. I know most of you. I'm really looking forward to diving into this conversation tonight. And to do that, I think it's really important that we kind of lay a solid foundation, right? So Professor Carter, I've known you for some years now, and every time that I'm in space with you, I seem to always learn more, not just about the topic at hand, but the history of community in relation to what we're talking about. So Professor Carter, if it's all right with you, I'm gonna go ahead and start. In the film, right, we see an examination of how Newark has policed its community over about the last 5 years. We know that there's been a long and sometimes brutal history, right, of how Black communities have been policed. But I would like for you to kind of give us a clearer picture, right, of the origins of policing and how this history impacts communities today, communities like us here in the city of Newark.
Well, thank you. And thank you, PSEG, and thank you, New Jersey PAC, for giving me this opportunity. I think more so than the history, it's important to look at what's at the heart of American policing, particularly of Black and brown people. So to start, I just want to say that we need to understand that unlike other uncolonized countries like Finland and Spain and France, they may have been involved in colonizing, but at the root of their police department, the root of their police system is not chattel slavery. Chattel slavery is at the root of our police system. People need to understand that on behalf of the property owners, the police, who were initially a militia, were charged with catching chattel slaves and returning them to their masters. Understand, this is a period when Black people were considered to be negotiable instruments, property, and they were bred like animals. So that mindset, in order to have that mindset, you had to have cognitive dissonance, which is recognized by both North Stanford, who was a police chief in Seattle, Washington, who wrote a book on how to fix America's police, and also Joy DeGruy, who actually wrote a book on post-traumatic slave syndrome. And so the concept of the inhumanity has to start with cognitive dissonance, thinking that a group of human beings were not human, but were just property. And that's very important in terms of understanding what is happening today with police and the mindset. And they don't necessarily know, because this is not part of their training. So I would next like to say that in addition to that, the police have served for the elite as maintaining social control. And Michelle Alexander mentions that in her book, The New Jim Crow, about this whole situation of social control, whether it was doing the Black codes with the Ku Klux Klan. After Reconstruction, there was no 40 acres and a mule. Instead, what was happening, the police would pick up Black men who didn't have jobs, and they were loitering because they weren't going to, they were no longer chattel slaves. And that became the role of the police. And so the state would lease out these people who were picked up by the police. They would lease them out back to the plantations and to mining companies. And the police and the state would actually get reimbursed for that. Afterwards, you have, Jim Crow. After Jim Crow, you have actually the immigrants coming in at the turn of the century, Italians, Irish, Polish, and Jewish people. They later become the police as they advance through the society. And many of the officers now are probably grandchildren or great-grandchildren of some of those individuals who were some of the first police in the turn of the century. And then later on, you have the police around the issues of heroin, marijuana in the 1950s in the jazz community. And so we move from people and sanitarians because they may be having problems with heroin, to now the police are again moving to social control. Then afterwards, during the 1960s, the Black Power movement, Young Lords, the Mexican movement. Then you have the beginning of COINTELPRO and police involved in the undermining of the civil rights movement, of Martin Luther King, of Malcolm X. You later have, in addition to that, later on, we have agent provocateurs. And that's something that we see on television all the time when property is being destroyed. Usually it's somebody who's infiltrated the organization in order to give the public, and I know we're going to talk about the media and the role of the media, but to give the public a certain perception. So it's important we understand that the police were involved in that too. So there's a long history of brutality, but in order to continue this, you have to condemn Black people. You have to see them as people who are not human, because that's the only way you shoot to kill, and be afraid of people. Whether it's a Black or a brown police officer, they take on the same attitudes too. It's not just a blue, it's just that you have situations where individuals of the same color also condemn Blackness. And so these are some of the results that we see. So I think that it's not so much the fact that the history of policing, it's more the fact that Black people and their position in this country is that part of a caste, as Isabella Wilkerson mentions, that we're at the bottom. And that people can do anything to us because we haven't quite moved as a group for many people in terms of having humanists. And so, I refer people to Mr. Khalil Muhammad's book, Condemnation of Blackness, because whether it's you're writing about Black people in the criminal justice system, the data, everything is geared to our inhumanity. So that makes it easy for people to treat Black people in the communities the way they do and not be punished. So I think I'll end on that and have people, bring it a little forward.
Definitely. I mean, Professor Carter, like I said, we always learn when we sit at the feet of our elders, and I thank you for bringing this wisdom to the conversation this evening, right? And as you talked, right, it struck me because I think there were several parts in the film that spoke to exactly what you were talking about. I think there was one piece where Mayor Baraka was sitting in the back of the car with Jelani, and Jelani was like, well, you know, these are Black and brown officers that are kind of treating the community this way. And the mayor goes ahead and responds, and he says, well, yeah, it doesn't matter who's committing the racist offense. It's still part of systemic racism, right? And that's our fight. No matter who's actually committing the harm, that's still a manifestation of systemic racism, and we need to stop it. So I appreciate you bringing that to the table, but I definitely want to create space for any of our other panelists to kind of chime in and bring some more of this kind of historical context around this notion of policing in Black and brown communities. And you can feel free to jump right in.
Yeah, this is Aqeela. I'll just share that, just echoing what Professor Carter had shared. You know, I come out of a culture, urban street gang culture, which a lot of social justice activists call the longest running war in the history of this country, right? We didn't give ourselves the label gang, right? The label was actually meant to dehumanize the people behind it and desensitize the public to the plight of the cry for these young Black and brown men and women who were literally disenfranchised and then scapegoated with all of the problems, you know, that were happening in the culture. About 15 years ago, prominent civil rights attorney Connie Rice did a report for the city of Los Angeles in which it was a call to action, in which she said basically less than 3 to 5% of so-called gang members are actually committing violent crime and murder. But if you look at the news, you would think that they are responsible for the majority of harm that's happening in urban neighborhoods, right? And so, you know, I just want to, you know, just iterate that you know, we've had, you know, issues as Black folks in terms of you know, the dehumanizing and labeling, you know, of us and our experience. We look at the war on drugs. You know, it was literally a war on people, right? And I think that some of what's happening in terms of the film helped to expose some of the undergirds of what's happening in the culture in terms of public safety and public health, right? Because I believe that those two pieces actually go hand in hand. And so, you know, I'll get an opportunity to talk a little bit more about, you know, the relationship or the correlation between public safety and public health a little later, maybe.
Cool. Thank you, Aqeela. And you know, that's the juicy part of the conversation for me, getting into that connection between public health and public safety. But what you talked about, right, is that kind of lived experience, you know? And we've got Jason here on our panel today, who I just met, seems to be an amazing individual doing some amazing work here in the city of Newark and here in the community. But Jason, I want to come to you next, right? Because we have some of the historical context, but I want to kind of move into a space where we're talking about the lived experience of today, right? So after hearing like the history of policing from Professor Carter, seeing the film and seeing like the countless Black bodies in the media that we see that have experienced violence from the hand of police, we know there's a need to kind of shift this notion of how policing happens and what accountability looks like, right? So I'm asking, would you be willing to kind of just share your experience with police? Let us know how you felt. Get to this question around, did you feel safe, right? How did you actually feel within that experience? And what could have been done differently to kind of increase your sense of safety and your sense of wholeness as a human being?
Thank you for that question. First off, I'd like to say thank you to PSEG and NJPAC for this wonderful opportunity. To answer that question, is still challenging, even though the incident happened a while back. And when a friend asked me if I'd be willing to share my story, I kind of said no. I did not want to relive that experience again. But she's a dear friend of mine, and she said, Jason, your story can actually help others. I told my story, and every time I tell my story, I always forget something. So this time I said, if I'm going to make an impactful statement, it'll be best that I write it down first and then share it. It's a little bit non-traditional to read while I'm doing a panel discussion, but today I'm not a licensed therapist. I'm not a manager. I'm just a Black man telling my story, who's going to read this story, if that's okay with you all.
Absolutely, brother.
So to start it off, watching the video, this is what I got. A cop was asked, how can you tell if someone's up to no good? Of course, I'm paraphrasing the question, but the cop response was, you as an officer build certain skills and you're able to read people. They give you a look and you just know. They should not be afraid of the police. You can point your weapon to make people comply with you. And once you feel that that threat is neutralized, you can put it away and have a normal reaction. These are statements from a gang unit in Newark, New Jersey. I believe these certain beliefs are the reason why I'm constantly harassed by the police. I'm shaking here. My name is Jason Dotson, and I have a threefold purpose today. First is to inform you of a situation that I've experienced. Second, to personalize a difficult topic. And third, to raise awareness on what is happening to Black and brown people, especially our Black men. I am a father of a teenage son who has recently enlisted in the Army to serve our country. I am a homeowner in the city of Newark who have been a resident for several years. I was a candidate running for elected office. I have received several awards for my work in the community. As a dual licensed mental health professional clinician working in public health who have earned 3 college degrees, aside from a job, I am active with community-based organizations within the city of Newark and served on several community advisory boards throughout the state of New Jersey. I personally know policymakers on the local, state, and federal level, and have had some of these amazing people over at my house for coffee. However, my accomplishments, accolades, and the company that I keep means nothing in the eyes of a police officer. Based upon my encounters with New Jersey police, especially Newark police, I am a nigger who is up to no good. On November 5th, 2016 at 9:15 p.m., I was ending my nightly jog when I was held at gunpoint by 18 police officers. I was thrown to the ground and searched for weapons and was not told why I was being apprehended. I like to make it known that at no time did I resist in any way. However, an extremely aggressive sergeant screamed at the top of his voice that they were looking for a man who fit my physical description. They were looking for a Black man wearing a t-shirt with cut-off sleeves. While I was being held at gunpoint, all I could think was, these young white cops are going to shoot me dead. And I would not have the chance to tell my friends and family that I love them. I actually thought I was going to die that night. After it was decided that I was not the person of interest, by comparing me to an image of a darker skinned man, much older man with a fuller beard and longer hair, I felt it was important to express my concerns of their practice. Nervous and upset, I calmly said that the guy who you're looking for looks nothing like me. And the only thing we have in common is that we are Black. I explained it's unacceptable and poor policing to pull every Black young man over and hold him hostage with guns pointed at them because they are Black and have facial hair. I understand that they were searching for a suspect, but even after it was clear that I was not the person they were looking for, the white sergeant continued yelling and screaming at me. While his back was turned, the other officer whispered his apologies. for this unwarranted and unjustified behavior. But it was clear that they were too intimidated to speak out in front of their superior. At that moment, I saw from the inside how the police force in my community operates. I ask you, ladies and gentlemen, what about this is acceptable to you? October 2014, I was stopped by police officers after dropping my friends off at school. I counted 12 cop cars behind me, with the commanding officer asking me, what am I doing in their neighborhood? And we are investigating a string of robberies in a car matching your description? Encouraged us to pull you over, boy. I stated, my GPS guided me on this route. Shut up! Shut the fuck up, and you're lying. What are you doing here? What saved me that night was an alibi from a friend. Who was pulled out of class that night, and also a gas receipt that I was too lazy to throw out. Summer 2009, I was pulled over in the city of Newark because the police officer wanted to know whose car I was driving, and if I could provide proof that I was the rightful owner. Just yesterday, I had to call the police because someone was blocking my driveway and preventing me from leaving my house. And after I explained to the cop that what was going on, I was constantly being asked questions. Where do you work at? What kind of job? What's your job? What kind of car do you drive? I'm concerned that the police department in Newark is guilty of unprovoked violence. All police officers have taken the oath to protect and serve. However, based upon my personal interaction with police officers, the oath to protect and serve does not apply to Black and brown people. Then we have the Karens and Kens, who raise racism only fuels the police violence that pushes the extension of Black race. We all seen the Amy Cooper video when she said, I'm going to tell them that there's an African-American man threatening my life. There's an African-American man threatening me and my dog. All because he asked her to put her dog on the leash. In closing, my experience with the Newark and Bridgewater police was unacceptable and fearful. No one should have to experience this violent treatment from those who were sworn to protect and serve. I pray that my sons and their friends and all my young Black brothers are safe when interacting with the police. The documentary ended the question, and I'll do the same. Do we have the will to act? Thank you.
Jason, thank you, man. Thank you for sharing. Thank you for showing up as your authentic self in this conversation. Like I said earlier, like these conversations are difficult, but it's important that we work through them. We're here together to be able to have these conversations. And it's important that through your sharing, right, that somebody else may now have the strength, the ability to share their story as well, to build more levers of accountability, right? Because until people start to share their experiences, right? So people start to report their experiences, these experiences stay within, they stay on the back burner, and we never have opportunities for accountability. And I just want to say, brother, I'm sorry that you had to go through that. No one should have to go through that. But I feel you, right? As a Black man having to live in this world, there's always this question when you are pulled over, like, how is this going to end? It's that thought that runs through our minds. And bro, that's traumatic for all of us, right? That puts us in a state where we become at ease, not at ease, excuse me. And it's important for us to be able to acknowledge that, but it's also important for us to make sure that police know how we feel and that they're doing the things that they need to do to hold themselves accountable and to change the policing, right? Because in your story, I heard you talk about that officer that apologized to you or whispered, right? And said, I'm sorry that you had to experience this and it went down this way. But what would it look like for that officer to step in at that moment and shut down the sergeant and say, nah, this isn't right? Like, this isn't why we need to be stopping. This isn't how we should be treating him, right? And that's the type of accountability that when these type of situations arise, that we want from our law enforcement, you know? But again, Jason, like I said, thank you for sharing. Again, I want to create some space here for others to kind of jump in and talk about what the lived experience has been for so many here in this country.
I would just reinforce the fact that the same approach to Black men not being human, it still exists in 2020. His experience is a good example of what has been happening for over 100 and some odd years. And it's really a sad commentary on this country. But if you think about it, the fact that you have to, people think of us as not being human. And you can't do these things to people if you think they're human. You just can't.
Right. Thank you, Professor Carter. Thank you. Colonel Callahan, I want to go to you next, right? So we've heard about the history. You joined the force over, what, 25 years ago now? You joined the ranks of the state police. Over that time, you've had experiences at all different levels within policing, right? And then in 2017, you rose to your current rank as colonel, where you lead over 3,000 officers, right, throughout the state of New Jersey. Undoubtedly, over your career, you've heard much of what we've heard here today, Jason's story, the history from Professor Carter. I know you joined us at the South Ward Public Safety Roundtable hosted by the Newark Community Street Team and Equal Justice USA, where we had a very similar conversation directly with community members. And I think we can all agree that the relationship between the state police and communities of color has really been tenuous, right, at best. So I want you to speak from your perspective as a leader in law enforcement. What has the evolution of policing, what has the evolution of the New Jersey State Police look like around accountability, around interacting with community? And what do you suggest, right, are the best strategies to hold law enforcement accountable while maintaining and enhancing safety within communities?
Thank you, Will, and thank you, everybody, including NJPAC and PSEG. Not easy for me to sit here as a trooper, let alone a man, and listen to Jason's story, or stories, I should say. And whispering apologies is not something that's gonna get it done for me. I think what it boils down to is transparency, it's professionalism, and it's accountability. Those three things primarily are what are going to change this narrative. And it is not, I know it's not lost to anybody on this Zoom meeting tonight that that's not a wand that gets waved overnight. I know Professor Carter, we talked about knowing those that we serve. And I think she pointed out last week, it's really about respecting those that you serve, not just knowing those that you serve. And we talked about the public's need to be part of public safety. I thought that was a great point. And to Jelani's policing the police, when you talk about formative experiences, which he talked about with Mayor Baraka, who I know pretty well, I know Director Ambrose and Darnell Henry, those formative experiences, they could be very positive too. And that's what kind of breaks my heart, that it could go either way. And the simplest thing of a squad mate stepping up, that to me, quite frankly, beyond, when I looked at that George Floyd murder, the fact that not one other police officer did a thing, to me, haunts me to this day. Right. I don't know how other police officers there did nothing. And I stress that. When you talk about accountability, if you talk about Citizen Complaint Review Board, if you want to talk about the measures and the Office of Law Enforcement Professional Standards, the accountability starts with holding one another accountable in the law enforcement community. That's what it is. If I'm on a stop or if I'm at a scene, that de-escalation and that, what are you doing? That's where it starts with law enforcement officer to officer, regardless of rank. You don't have to wait for a supervisor to show up. I thought that jumped out at me. And I think what also came out of the policing the police was the effectiveness of consent decrees. I know that question got asked there. And I think as a young trooper who was on the road when we went into the consent decree with the Department of Justice, and I fast forward those so many years and think of how much better we are now, the New Jersey State Police. Are we perfect? No, we're not by any stretch. But nationally, we have organizations around the country that ask, what is the New Jersey State Police doing about community engagement, doing about use of force reporting, doing about risk management, doing about early warning systems to identify officers maybe struggling with addiction, struggling with anger management, struggling with implicit bias. And that's a special place to be after going through a consent decree. So I thought that Jelani and that documentary pointed that out. From my perspective, I think consent decrees are extremely effective and warranted when agencies cannot seem to police themselves. I think our Attorney General in the last 3 years has done a phenomenal job with community engagement and diversity and inclusion. Our Citizens Academy that we've had to make ambassadors, so we pull back that curtain and show how we investigate shootings, to show how we investigate in custody deaths, to show how we hold each other accountable, because that's what the public wants. They want to see that qualified immunity isn't a free pass for a law enforcement officer to do whatever he or she wants and be defended by some, legal technicality. So I'm, again, it did kind of break my heart to listen to Jason's story. And as long as I'm in this position, I'm going to do everything, not only for the New Jersey State Police, but for law enforcement in New Jersey and around the country, to make sure that when people see this and see that blue uniform, that it instills a sense of calm and not fear. Because I don't know, people shouldn't be afraid to call 911, and they call it every day. And if you don't want to call 911 because you're afraid who's going to show up at your door, that obligation is on law enforcement to change that narrative. So again, humbled and honored to be on. Thanks, Will.
Thanks, Colonel. Again, creating space for other participants to chime in, maybe respond to what we just heard from Colonel Callahan, speak to what we've seen in our different respective roles in our engagement, in our interaction with law enforcement, how that actually shows up, and really what community is calling for accountability, right? I think here in the city of Newark, I believe it was Professor Carter, and I think the Colonel brought it up again, we talked about the CCRB, Civilian Complaint Review Board, a battle that started back in the 60s to make sure that communities had control over how they were policed, right? What law enforcement looked like. And we've seen it. We've seen it move starting earlier this year. It's actually been moving through the kind of leadership and support of Mayor Baraka, community leadership and advocacy with brothers like Zayed Muhammad and Newark Communities for Accountable Policing, who have been holding that banner up, folks like Larry Ham, who have been on the front lines to make sure that we're talking about this and we're explaining not just to those that, get on the Zoom calls, not just to those that read the emails and go check a website, but folks that are actually in community that have these interactions with law enforcement, the importance of a community civilian complaint review board and what it can really do to enhance safety in our neighborhoods and for our community members. So again, maybe Aqeela, if you want to chime in here, or Professor Carter, feel free.
Well, let me just say this really quickly. The fact that we're in litigation about something that allows the community to control their own destiny says that whole idea of inhumanity, that is it's a continuous demonstration that we are not human. Because if we were considered human by the police and the PBA and everyone else, then why would we have to go to court for something that we should automatically have? As a matter of fact, if we were treated like Short Hills, Millburn, Saddlebrook, it wouldn't have been a problem. But it's Newark, and it's really the people in Newark. And so, the common thread that goes through all of this, that should be part of the police training, an integral part of their training, is to understand that they are treating Black and brown people as though they're not human. Everything I've heard tonight is a continuous thread for over 100 years of not treating us like we're human.
Thank you, Professor Carter.
And just following up on Professor Carter, I mean, we're at an inflection point in this country in terms of public safety, right? Safety is not the same, you know, for Black people that it is for white people. I mean, straight up, Black folks have never felt safe in this country, right? Safety is not just the absence of violence and crime, you know, from a perspective of law enforcement. It's also the presence of well-being in the infrastructure to support victims and survivors in their respective healing journey, right? So we can't just give public safety over to law enforcement. And I know that you know, historically we say public safety and people say police. And the reality is that you can't have public safety without the public, right? And so what's the role that the public should play in the public safety process? And I say that we should lead it, you know, that the public should lead public safety. We know that only 1% of those who are committing violent crime or murders are driving 75% of the crime in a particular city, right? Law enforcement should have a focused deterrent strategy on that 1%. If 60 to 70% of the calls that people are doing are for quality of life issues and just, you know, noise disturbance, why are we having our mental health issues? Why are we having our cops to respond to those things? Right. You know, when we already know what the outcome has been historically, right? And so the response is there is a solution to reimagining public safety and police reform. And it's not just procedural justice trainings and de-escalation trainings and trauma-informed strategies for cops. It's investing in community-based infrastructure, in community-based public safety initiatives. Like NCST is not new. I mean, we might be new in Newark, you know, but community-based public safety initiatives like Newark is happening in over 200 cities across the country and have evidence-based results that shows that residents trained as public safety professionals utilizing a relationship-based approach through a public health frame has the capacity to reduce violence and crime significantly as a complementary strategy to law enforcement and without law enforcement. LA has 10 consecutive years in a row of decreases in homicides and showing how community-based intervention, community-based public safety has made the city a safer place. However, for 10 consecutive years, community-based intervention has gotten no investment. They get no overtime pay. They do get no cost of living increase. However, these individuals, and we know some of them, you know, sacrificing their lives on a daily basis in our neighborhood to prevent violence and crime from happening. You know, but we're caught in this strange like kind of moment, right? And I think that that now is an opportunity, because we're in an inflection point, to be able to lift up community-based public safety, to invest more money in community-based infrastructure, because safety is a shared strategy. It can't just be law enforcement as a single point of contact for safety in our respective community. We got to have the health department, we got to have faith, we got to have community-based organizations, we got to have all of these agencies working together to provide services for the victims, the survivors, right? Because the victim, the survivor, has to be at the center of public safety policy and strategy. And so what we're talking about now, and I think in terms of reimagining public safety and talking about policing the police, is that we have to give our cops some help, right? Meaning that we have to take away the responsibilities that we put on them that overburdens them, that they really are just doing a terrible job at performing. It's almost like, you know, when the pandemic hit, it exposed all our broken public health infrastructure. And you know what we did? We asked cops to go out and ask people to shelter in place and to wear PPEs, putting them in the direct line of fire with all of the trauma, you know, that people are suffering through in the community. I'm a big, fan of our brother and of our honorable mayor, Ras J. Baraka, because he looked at what was happening in New York and said, hey, we're not going to have the same thing with the excessive force issues that was happening with the cops in New York, in Newark. And so he deemed, outreach workers, essential workers, and had us to be on the front line, right? In terms of talking to our residents and our family and friends, asking them to shelter in place. We took food and we took PPEs. because you got to take all of those things in order to negotiate with our people, right? Their own safety, you know? And I think that that although we probably saw that as something that was, you know, out of the norm, we need to make that normal, you know? Because we can't just go to people and tell them, hey, go in the house and stay in the house. You know, we got to provide supportive services, and we got to ask those deeper questions. I mean, we did a survey in the community asking about people's level of vulnerability. And as a result of it, you know, in partnership with the city, we distribute over 1,100 meals a day. And because that was a real need for our folks. That is creating safety, you know, in communities. And you know, I'm gonna get off my soapbox so I can give somebody else an opportunity to say something.
It's all good. Anybody else want to chime in here?
I would just add that historically, especially for Scuttle Homes, where I grew up, the Nation of Islam served as our police. That's who served our community. We made decisions. And that's something that I remember Minister Farrakhan saying, at the Million Man March, he mentioned this, that we can resolve conflict in our own communities, but we no longer know how. And I just want two things to give people another chance. One is when people are talking about defunding police, and people have spun that. They're not talking about the fact we don't need police. I think the mayor also mentioned that. But the main thing is that also a lot of Black people have been convinced and don't understand that we haven't always used police in our own communities.
Right.
The other thing is that we have to budget our values. And that's what was just spoke about. All those things are our values, which means when the budget is happening, we have to look at what's most important: education, health, and all those issues. And the last thing I'd say is, and this is for everyone, because a lot of people don't understand, because they don't understand that the media makes a lot of money off of these terms. One is, when people say Black Lives Matter, they really mean Black Lives Matter too, too. That Black lives are as entitled to respect as anyone else. It's not to take away from anybody. It's just to say that, don't forget, we bleed too.
So important, Professor Carter. So important. Thank you for bringing that up. Aqeela, I want you to get back on that soapbox a little bit, brother, and tout some of the successes that we've seen here in the city of Newark, right? The Newark Community Street Team has been operating here on the ground. Other organizations, we've got West Ward Victims Outreach, right? We've got the Brick City Peace Collective. We got organizations like the Hub. We've got Newark Street Academy. When we see in the news, right? So you talked about LA has experienced these 10 years of decreased violence, right? We're on a pretty good track here in the city of Newark too, right?
That's right.
So talk about that a little bit, but also, right, we had a moment this past summer where the mayor and our city council actually approved a vote to actually move $11 million from the traditional police budget to support the development of an Office of Violence Prevention too. So I'm hoping, so I'm asking you to really quickly talk about a lot, right?
Yes, sir.
So if you could also talk about what this Office of Violence Prevention can really do here in the city of Newark, and some of the potential that it has to really enhance safety and the public's role in safety here.
Yes, sir. Well, first, I just want to start out and give a shout out to our sister Keisha Yuri, who is the director of the Office of Violence Prevention and Trauma Recovery, but then also a longtime activist and therapist and healer in the city of Newark. And so you guys know that in 2014, the mayor conceived and launched the Newark Community Street Team and tapped me to build infrastructure, to put systems in place, and then turn it over to the local people. And so for the past 6 years, I've been engaged in that process and doing that. We started out as a 16-member organization, all independent contractors. Today, we're a 50-member organization. I would say we're probably the second largest employer in the South Ward, anchor nonprofit in the South Ward. That was the mayor's vision for the work. And one of the things that he wanted to do when we launched was to develop a coordinated strategy in the city around public safety. So he commissioned this group called the Safer Newark Council. We worked with Rutgers, with the Department of Health, with NPD, with several community-based organizations to coordinate our public safety strategy in the city. When we started this work, I think the city had a little over 100 murders. I think 109 murders in 2015. Rutgers did a study basically, you know, kind of laying out the foundation for us, because we like to think of ourselves as data informed, and, you know, and it informs our strategy, that 62% of the homicides in 2015 were domestic disputes, or started as domestic disputes. So our strategy has always been a relationship-based strategy, working through the public health lens, that if we stand in the gap and we intervene on those domestic disputes before they get violent and someone is harmed, then we can prevent, you know, trauma, you know, from rippling and impacting the community in a huge way, right? And so NCST has a three-pronged strategy: a high-risk intervention team. We have outreach workers that do mentoring through a case management model, as well as, providing safe passage in community. Our theory of change is our victim services piece. We believe that if we better serve victims, then we prevent them from becoming perpetrators. We launched the city's first hospital-based violence intervention program. We have 3 outreach workers who are embedded in the hospital. So when individuals are harmed and they go there, we're able to meet them, consent them bedside, and then provide them services as they transition back in the community in terms of working with them on a safety plan, right? Just in terms of the past 4 years or 5 years since we've been in operation, we started out with 109 murders in the city. In 2019, we had 51. So we've had 4 consecutive years in a row now of decreases of homicide and overall violence in the city. In the South Ward, where we've targeted our strategy, last year we had a negative 48% reduction in homicide. Our vision, this coalition, the Brick City Peace Collective that's working together, focused on the South Ward, our strategy is to bring violence to 0 in the next 3 years, right? And again, this is a coordinated strategy. We work, we have another body that is our policy body, the Public Safety Roundtable that EJ, our brother Will, facilitates. We bring about 60 people together on a bi-monthly basis to basically hold, ourselves, law enforcement, electeds, accountable for the services that they're supposed to be providing in our respective community. The work has been highly successful. We still got a lot of work to go as we're building out infrastructure in terms of the work. But one of the things that I'm most excited about, as Will said, in June, the mayor introduced an ordinance with the city council to move 5% of NPD's $230 million budget into a new Office of Violence Prevention and Trauma Recovery. And that was passed unanimously. Keisha Uri is now the head of the Office of Violence Prevention and Trauma Recovery, and we're working with her to establish this complementary strategy, again, so that we don't put so much pressure on our cops to be therapists and teachers and coaches and, everything, so that there is some balance. And so the Office of Violence Prevention and Trauma Recovery will put social workers and navigators within the police department so that we can better respond to mental health issues in crisis, right? It'll fund community-based organizations to do safe passage, which is an evidence-based piece that we launched that deters violence, in and around our schools. They'll also be able to fund high-risk intervention teams, hiring, ex-gang members, ex-convicts who have changed their lives, who have atoned for the wrongs, and who have been highly trained in conflict resolution and mediation and escalation strategies and trauma-informed approaches to engage their friends and family members, and to utilize their relationships to prevent conflicts from happening. Now, we can't always stop the first shooting, but we can damn near stop the second and the third one. And so that has been our overall strategy. We work in close concert with NPD. I think that we've had a few major victories in terms of our relationship. Believe it or not, I mean, NPD calls us and gives us intelligence. There's a pretty high threshold in terms of arrest and prosecution around crimes that are committed in the neighborhood. And so sometimes when there is no murder weapon and there's no witness that's going to be willing to come forward, we get that call, from one of the deputy chiefs or from Captain Douglas saying, hey, here is the intelligence that we know about what's happening in this neighborhood. Can you guys step in and utilize your relationships to try to prevent this thing from escalating and someone losing their life? We don't have the same approach in terms of law enforcement and community-based intervention, right? We don't have the same approach, but we have the same goal. And the same goal is to make our community safe and to create greater opportunities for our folks in the neighborhood to engage the public safety process. And so, yeah, so we're, I feel like, we're just beginning in Newark, right? We're also providing a lot of what we learned over the past 6 years to our partners in Jersey City, in Patterson, in Atlantic City, in Camden, in Trenton, in Elizabeth, in Asbury Park. So we're working with all of these individuals right now, these respective organizations, to help them to put together infrastructure so that they can support public safety infrastructure in their respective city and be able to have a coexisting relationship with law enforcement in terms of collectively working to drive down violence and crime, but also to create alternative avenues, for folks in the community to be employed and to participate in the public safety process.
Thank you so much for giving us that breakdown, Aqeela. So my phone is blowing up. We've got 30 something questions in the Q&A queue here. But before we dive into some of the questions that we have, I would like to give our panelists just maybe 2 minutes apiece to talk about what we can do next, right? So Aqeela talked about the public safety roundtable. In that conversation, it's an action-oriented space where we'd like to talk about the issues, but the focus is what can we do as community? What can we do in our respective roles to move this work forward and enhance this idea of healing, safety, and accountability for everybody in our community, right? So I'm gonna actually start with you, Professor Carter. If you can give us maybe 1 or 2 things that we can do as community members or wherever we sit in our roles to kind of support this work.
Okay, really quickly. A lot of things I have, I'll provide to New Jersey PAC so they can put it on their board. There's several books, How to Fix America's Police by Norm Stanford, who speaks to the militarization of police, and some of the books I mentioned. But just real quick, there is an article by Peggy McIntosh, which is basically the 50 things that white people don't have to think about and don't have to worry about, that I would refer people to. The other thing is free. It's on YouTube. Everybody can look at it. If you deal with Black people in any capacity, you need to do this course. It's called Black Minds Matter. It's by 5 PhD candidates in education working with their professor at San Diego State in response to a police killing of a Black man. They wanted to do something different and historic. It's 15 hours. Black Minds Matter. It shows the comparison between police and Black bodies and the education system, pre-K to doctoral, that would be helpful. And the last thing I would say is that it's about people controlling their resources as opposed to having lobbyists and politicians deciding how their money is going to be appropriated. So I have a toolbox that I refer people to. One is to read and be discerning about what you read. Use the public library because it's the only place that doesn't have an agenda. The other thing is learn civics, what your power is, individually and the collective. Pay attention to who you give your money to. Do they respect your community, right? And if you are able to, you really want to use civics and learn as much as possible, and everyone in your house and your family, to help put pressure on your elected officials so that instead of taxpayers paying for police misconduct, let the PBA and the police pay their own insurance. When people are using tax money, they become very reckless. But when their assets are up for grab, they have a whole different look on things. And so a lot of the recklessness may disappear when police or PBAs decide that they should be paying for police misconduct and not taxpayers.
Right. Thank you, Professor Carter. And I just want to let everybody know that a lot of these recommendations, a lot of these action steps, these resources are going to be put up online for us to kind of really dive into. But I just want to lift up something Professor Carter said there, something that even Colonel Callahan talked about, this qualified immunity thing and how that is this shield that protects law enforcement, right? We need to examine that. We need to figure out how we as community can play a role in making sure that that isn't something that exists to kind of protect bad actors within the policing field. Jason, I'm gonna come to you next, brother. 1 or 2 things that folks can do to move this conversation forward, to kind of change the way public safety looks in our communities.
So I forgot to talk about the experience of trying to report my situation. But what I recommend, because reporting is important as well too, but trauma within the Black community. As a therapist, I always talk about how Black folks, we're not conditioned to talk to therapists. We're not conditioned to talk about our trauma. We're not conditioned to talk about what it was like when that cop pulled us over and he was still pissed off, and how do we process that? So we go and do something else, or we have mistrust within our community. So, or within the LGBTQ community as well too. I had a trans girl who was attacked, and the police basically just ridiculed her. And when she turned to her community to talk about it, their response was, just pretend like it didn't happen, let's get over it. What I recommend is, so in New Jersey, we have this thing called Perform Care, where children ages 5 all the way up to 18, sometimes 19, can provide free therapy for our young men, our young Black men. As a therapist, I have, my whole caseload is filled with Black men who have experienced trauma with the police. And they're in our gangs or other situations that are compromising. Also, the Pride Center for our LGBTQ folks, which is located at 17 Academy Street in Newark, New Jersey. Come in there and getting the service that you need or the resources to talk about the trauma. Talking about how can we build a community? How can we support one another? No more the whole idea, let's just talk about what the police did to us, but actually creating a formal process and go out there to internal affairs and talk about what happened so we can see change. And that's pretty much all I have right now.
Thank you, Jason. So Colonel Callahan, Aqeela, again, 1 or 2 things that people can do. I'm gonna really quickly go to you first, Colonel Callahan.
Just real quick, and I know we talk about youth and programs. I saw when I watched the Policing the Police, the one, it was a Newark town hall meeting, and the one woman couldn't get past the Newark police officer's uniform. You know, she saw it as a symbol of, I think, oppression. And I think so. I always was bothered when I was in a convenience store and a 5 or 6-year-old was acting up, and the mother said, "You better behave or he's going to handcuff you and take you away." That's juxtaposed to the message they get of, you need to go to the police when you need help, when you have a problem, when you need a conflict resolved. So from an early age, I think we need to start engaging with youth to show them that we are at the point that we are Sunday school teachers, that we are baseball coaches, that we are counselors. Not that we need to do that in our 9-to-5 job, which I think Aqeela made a really great point about that, to take that pressure off of us. But I think from a very young age, and I mean early on, elementary school, engaging with the youth to have them change the notion. And if their parents have bad, as we talked about, those formative experiences with police, those kids are going to have the same feelings about the police. And I think we need to start at a very early age to do that. And to Jason's point about internal affairs, we need to be about as open as possible about those processes, that transparency, and reveal what it is that we do to police ourselves. So if the public thinks we can't police ourselves, that's why there's legislation about police reform. That's why there's the push for citizen complaint review boards. And I'm not dispelling the need for either one of those, but I think we don't do a good job, at least I can only speak for the New Jersey State Police, on letting people know about the motor vehicle stop data that we collect, the reason for the stop, race, the age, the gender. Were you searched? Were you asked out of the car? Was it a negative search? Were you issued a summons or a warning? We collect more data than any other agency in the world, and yet we don't let anybody know about it. And I think if we showed not only what we collect, how we analyze it to identify troopers that fall beyond their squad mates, I think we need to do a better job of showing the amount of effort we put into risk management to identify officers that perhaps are those bad apples that were highlighted in the documentary. Thanks, Will.
Colonel. And Aqeela?
Yeah, 2 things. One, I would say that, you know, folks are always looking for a point of entry to be able to enter this work and to be involved. And so I would say, come and attend the public safety roundtable meetings that we host in the South Ward twice a month. The next one is November the 24th at 10 a.m. from 10 to 12. I think it's a great place to come and engage, with residents and also with many of the folks in the city about what's happening in your respective community in terms of public safety. If you want to get involved on another level, right? Toby Sanders, who is the Director of Education and Training for NCST, we launched last year through a grant that we got with the city, a program called the Community Sentinels Program. And Community Sentinels is a 10-week training program that educates folks in the neighborhood about public safety policy and civics and history, right? It's critical. If you go and ask in our schools right now, most of our kids, like, who is your city council person and what is the role of the city council person? I guarantee you less than 5% would be able to answer you intelligently and know how to respond to that question. We just have to create more opportunities for to engage our folks. And I think that people engage this work from a very emotional place. And so I think that that a third thing that I would share, Will, is in terms of our own kind of self-care. Dr. Carter said it, we, are traumatized, and we experience, traumatic stress, hypervigilance, vicarious trauma, and rarely do we actually get help and support. Micheline Davis was just sharing with me offline a program that they're getting ready to launch with the Black Psychologists Association so that we can get, more people to access therapy, or we can change the name, wellness checkups. But we gotta, have more access to healing services, both individual and group counseling, as well as alternative healing technologies, because everybody doesn't respond to kind of Eurocentric, healing modalities. So we got to have like a plethora of these things to offer folks in the community.
Great, thank you, Aqeela. And before we move to Q&A, I'm going to use my personal privilege, right, as the moderator, to throw one or two things in here as well. I would say the first is, right, just really get engaged with the things that are happening in your community. If you're a resident of the city of Newark, what is your block association doing around public safety, right? How are you engaging your city council people in their efforts to kind of promote public safety and enhance the role of the public in what its safety looks like? Join some of the conversations. Aqeela talked about the public safety roundtable. A lot of our community-based violence intervention organizations are doing community walks out in the communities that we all live in, right? Support them, join them on the walk. You can reach out to Dawn Haynes at the Brick City Peace Collective to find out more there. I think they're online, they're on Facebook. I mean, a bunch of different ways to get engaged there. But also, I really want to urge folks to ensure that we're doing something that Jason said, right? When we have an interaction with law enforcement that we view as negative or we view as unjustified, we need to report that, right? We have mechanisms within our community to make reporting as easy as possible. You can go to anybody on this call and they'll help you, right, figure out what it looks like for you to report something to internal affairs. You can go to your pastors, you can go to your community leaders, you can go to any officer within our city here in the city of Newark to actually make a complaint. And why this is so important is because when we look at the data, if folks aren't reporting their experience, then it kind of gives law enforcement a pass to say, hey, we're doing everything great because nobody's reporting anything negative, right? So when we have these experiences, it's incumbent upon us to make sure that we're telling folks and we're documenting what our experience is, so that the system can hold folks accountable, but for us as community, that we have the leverage we need to hold our leaders, our electeds, our law enforcement agencies accountable as well. So that's my 2 cents from the facilitator side. I think this is the part that we want to get into now is the Q&A. I want to thank all of our panelists for your time and the prep that led up to this, for your time to bring the wisdom and your knowledge and your experiences to light during this conversation. So thank you again, humbled to be able to kind of hold this container to have this important dialogue with some of the really amazing, phenomenal people. I was looking at the Q&A list, and like I said, there's a ton of questions here. But one kind of stood out to me, and it's actually, I think, directed to you, Colonel Callahan. Lauren L. Bryant, right? I spent Saturday night having to weigh calling a mobile mental health crisis unit versus not, while dealing with a suicidal young Black man who said he couldn't promise me that he would be around Sunday to call me, right? I had to promise him that the cops would not respond alone. But when I called the mobile crisis unit, I warned them I don't want the visit to escalate to suicide by cop, which is an experience that we've seen so many times within our community, right? What is being done to ensure that law enforcement statewide engages in mandatory crisis intervention training? And I think this is probably a top of mind at a lot of folks for right now, because what we've seen in the media, right? We had Maurice Gordon, who went through a mental health crisis, died in that interaction with the state police. Can you go ahead and attempt to answer that, Colonel Callahan?
I can, and we are required, the Attorney General, we've done crisis intervention training and the handling of emotionally disturbed persons for years. The Attorney General Graywall has made a new renewed push for that, given how sometimes tragically that those encounters end. I'll highlight the one from Camden a couple days ago. And that was two of our newest troopers with a young teenager from Camden on the overpass on over 676. And he was so close to jumping off into traffic. And I watched these two young troopers, that compassion that I talk about when I'm with them, and not escalating it, and how they saved that young man's life. And Pastor Amir Khan from Camden calling me and letting me know how much that meant. That's what we need to do. And we need to see to it that when we're called, again, back to Aqeela's point, should an armed police officer be the one responding to those things? I'm not sure I know the answer to that, but people call 911 for a stray cat in their condominium, and they call us for people struggling in mental crisis, and they call us for everything in between, and expect us to be all of those things. And you better do it right, because everything's on film, and you know you're going to be scrutinized. And I land on, if you treat everybody with compassion and according to the Constitution, the compassion that you use in that incident has to be followed by the constitutionality of that act. There is no way to separate the two. So I think, to her question, that we are doing a lot with regards to crisis intervention training, and each incident is different, but I think that the better we make our law enforcement officers prepared for those encounters, the better the outcomes will be, Will.
Thank you, Colonel. I'm gonna jump ahead to a next question. One of the most discouraging things for me in the history of police reform is how fervently police unions fight any systemic measure of accountability or transparency. We see this with what happened to the Newark CCRB, even after the consent decree, right? After the FOP lawsuit, as well as police unions' current challenge to new AG guidelines. How can civilians trust the police, right? How can civilians trust the police when the police as a group fight any real accountability to the community? That question was, again, directed towards you, Colonel Callahan, but I would like to open that up to anybody else on the panel that would like to respond.
I just want to make a point that quotes to something that might be helpful. There's a PBS documentary called Race, the Power of an Illusion. And people must understand that the whole concept of race was made up. And I think, we need to understand, and in the police training, these are things that need to be included in the training. Actually, the courts made up this artificial construct, but we conduct ourselves that way. That's how we conduct ourselves in society. As a matter of fact, there were 38 different degrees of being white, according to this documentary. And the people on the low end were Italians, Irish, Polish, and Jewish. And that's really important, because those historically are the people who are involved in the police department and need to understand in the training. Everything I've talked about needs to be included in the training. If you're going to deal with Black people and you don't include in the training something beyond bias training. Bias training is something that everybody is biased. So it's neutralized when you say bias training. We need to look at what's at the heart of why people are disrespected. And if we're not going to do that, then we're wasting our time.
Thank you, Professor Carter. I'll also add one thing that Equal Justice has committed to do here in the city of Newark is to work with our community here as well as Newark PD to actually walk through what we call trauma to trust, right? It's an intensive 16-hour training that gets to the heart of a lot of what you presented here tonight, Professor Carter, to really understand the roots and foundations of systemic racism in this country, to anti-Blackness in this country, how marginalized groups have been oppressed, and how that connects to policing today, right? And what that evolutionary through line to policing back then to where we are now is. So I just wanted to add that as well. But Colonel Callahan, I mean, this conversation around police unions comes up all the time in every single conversation that we have about accountability. Just from your space, right? I think before I turn it over to you, I just want to say, when we hear from the unions, they always talk about, well, the law says that we're able to do this, right? Without acknowledging the fact that the laws and policies have been developed in an inherently racist way that marginalize and diminish Black and brown bodies in the way that they're carried out, right? So when you hear this conversation about the role of police unions and kind of preventing accountability, preventing the advancement of this kind of notion of transforming policing, how do you respond, right? What is your view from where you sit on the role of police unions as a barrier to us moving forward?
Yeah, it's a great question, and one that, again, I sat as the chair of our New Jersey State Police Pension Board for 6 years and watched troopers come before us with dishonorable service issues, you know, when they're up to whether losing part or all of their pension based upon what they did. And my experience, I would say, is a little bit different. I think our police unions, from my experience in the New Jersey State Police, they want to hold their members accountable. Do they also, because of their dues that are paid, or do they have to get them legal representation? Sometimes, but not all the times, based upon the behavior. So that perception of the union presidents and union membership digging their heels in and fighting every last bit of reform, I think they want things to be fair for their members. And I don't see them as fighting every last piece. And again, I've watched things around the country, and I know different union presidents are sometimes more vocal than others. But as I've explained to them, if they go to the mat for every single trooper that does something wrong, that their credibility is completely diminished. They need to stand up and fight for if a trooper did something in good faith or egregious and deserves to be terminated. They need to make that determination the same as I do, because when they start going to the mat for the ones that should be fired, then that's when the conversation ends. And I think that's when the public says, how would you go to the mat for that person? And I think that's where at least our New Jersey State Police Union leadership has not diminished their credibility in supporting every single member that has a substantiated internal affairs investigation against them.
Thank you for that response. Did anybody else want to respond there? If not, I'll go to the next question. All right, I'll just move forward. So this question, I think, is from Josie Gonzalez. I may be wrong. I think we're having a tech issue, so some questions are popping up under different people's names. My question, and this is her here, my question is triggered by Rick's introduction. If policing is grounded in the protection of property, and we accept that racial identity is fused with property codified in US law, how do we begin to decolonize the police without addressing constitutional law that codifies Blacks as 3/5 under Article 2 as an example, and deconstructing whiteness, which affords protections of person, capital, and property? So again, I offer that to our panelists to respond to. Jason, Aqeela, Professor Carter, I turn it over to you.
Yeah, I would just start off by saying that I think that we've invested enough money in reform, police, and this is just my opinion, right? We haven't invested in enough in community-based infrastructure. I think that that the fastest way to stop, excessive force issues and misconduct issues is that you police your own community. So I believe that we have to train residents as public safety professionals. We have to reallocate, resources to these initiatives on the ground, so that they become complementary strategies to law enforcement. I think that unions play, a significant role in terms of the work. I mean, a couple of weeks ago, we had Jimmy Stewart, was the head of the FOB, to come to the Public Safety Roundtable and talk about, some of the things that he stated in the Police documentary. The community got on him heavy about it, and respectfully so. And but I was excited that honestly he came, to face the community and to answer the hard questions, right? We have to create more authentic space for dialogue, and it can't just be about the conversation. It has to be about the action that happens afterwards, right? And so, we had a great dialogue. I think that we're engaged in an interesting relationship in terms of talking about how we provide safety in our respective community. But again, I'm primarily focused on the solution. I don't have much bandwidth to be fighting against anything like these days. I'm only fighting for things. And so I'm going to put all my focus and energy in building infrastructure and systems for community-based public safety as a complement to law enforcement. And then as we move forward, I mean, next year, I'd love to see Newark, the city, remove another 5%, from Newark PD's budget. And I'd like to see every major city across the country do the same thing to fund community-based intervention and to focus our law enforcement on serious, violent issues in the community, right? Something in LA, like 57% of homicides are unsolved. And they have one person investigating all 57, percent of these homicides are unsolved. It is ridiculous what we're doing with our tax dollars in terms of public safety in cities. It's just ridiculous. And I think that that the veil has been lifted, and I think we can see clear now. And the more people that we get engaged in civic education and the public safety process, I think the sooner we'll see a real shift take place in terms of our relationship between community and law enforcement. Yeah.
Thanks, Aqeela. And so, Professor Carter, I saw you shaking your head, and Jason.
Yeah, well, right, definitely. I think, first of all, I came out of a we community. When I grew up in Newark, in the heart of the city, it was about we, it wasn't about me. And so as a group of people, we have to think in the community and not as individuals. And I understand there's a history to that. When affirmative action is the line where we move from a we community to a me community. And so we have to stop condemning, and going back to his point, in order for us to do that, we have to value ourselves more than we do beyond material things. We have to value ourselves as individuals, as part of a community. And, part of this is just who we are. We're social people, we're communal people. That's the way we were. We kind of left that after affirmative action. I think it's important that each one of us individually needs to look at ourselves and say, what can we do? Because he's right. We have the capacity to police our own community, and we don't even want to police our community. Just revert back to those things that work, that helped us navigate and negotiate through chattel slavery up to the time of affirmative action when we acted in a we capacity. And I think that, that's real important. I also offer that I'm more than happy, as someone who teaches American government, I'm more than happy to come, and I don't even want to get paid, but I will come in and do civics courses for people for free. So just call me.
And if I can add, I agree with Aqeela as well as the professor as well too. But also, what we're seeing right now is the younger generation, they're doing great work and they need our support. I think they are actually challenging the systems. They're actually getting involved. They're actually, they're basically bringing attention. And I see great things with this community. And I see that they're actually changing the system, and they're going to actually hold their elected officials or run for office that will help with the process of policing the police. Just providing support for the kids and for the youth.
Thank you, Jason. Thank you, Professor Carter. I'll just add, when Aqeela started talking about we need to actually fund these community-based violence intervention efforts in the state of New Jersey, I want to say, and Aqeela, correct me if I'm wrong, I think it was back in 2019 now, we all advocated for and got passed the S3309, which would create a community violence intervention fund at the state level to actually fund these innovative and transformative programs that center community around public safety. But it's not funded yet, right? It was supposed to be a $15 million fund, and it still sits today unfunded. So as we move into this next legislative cycle, call your elected officials, call your neighbors, talk about the effectiveness of community-based violence intervention work, and let's make sure that in this next year, in 2021, we get this thing funded, and we start to really support this infrastructure that Aqeela was talking about around the state to enhance these programs.
And Will, if I might just add that we just passed marijuana legalization in the state. It's going to create millions and millions of dollars, in tax savings. And that is the fund,
right,
where that money is going to come from to fund community-based public safety.
Exactly.
I've already heard that law enforcement has been calling for 50%, of the marijuana tax dollars. And I'm like, yeah, if they're calling for 50%, then they should be breaking bread. Half of that should come to community-based intervention. So Colonel, we with you, bro.
I didn't ask for any of it, Aqeela.
So Colonel, we
want you to go ask with us.
Right, we need you out there saying that you don't want it and that money should come to support these community-based efforts. That's that type of allyship that we need from the law enforcement side, right? I want to go to maybe one or two more questions here. Years ago, it was close to a 2-year process to be a person before a person was able to wear a blue uniform in New York. First training and next wore a gray uniform and partnered with another officer. Then upon graduation, went on to a blue uniform, and there was an intense psychological testing, right? What does that look like here in New Jersey, right? What is that evolution for an officer? What is that evolution for a New Jersey State Police officer? And what type of psychological testing goes into the process of becoming an officer?
It's actually, and I'll just real briefly, the first thing we do is the physical training test. We do that first. If they pass, we open up an online application, you apply if you're deemed eligible. And this is the Attorney General's office and a third-party vendor also oversee this to that transparency point, that it's not just the New Jersey State Police doing the selection process. After a member passes the physical training test, they then are invited to the written. After the written, if they pass that, a background investigation is done pretty thorough. The last stage is to the person who asked the question, is the psychological test. And believe it or not, that has knocked a lot of folks out of the box, and rightly so. Because if our troopers aren't healthy here and mentally, they're not going to serve the public at the, in the capacity that we need them to serve. So very big piece of our selection process is the psychological testing. They then go to the academy. This class isn't allowed to go home. They reported 203 recruits. We're down to 182. They get tested every week. They will then get partnered up with a trooper when they graduate in March and be on the road for 3 months with what we call a trooper coach. So it's a very intense, just because you get through the academy doesn't mean that you're going to be, a trooper. We have a 2- and 4-year re-enlistment, just like the military. So if there's internal affairs issues and you have 3 years on, that's part of our process that you could be terminated. So a lot of scrutiny goes into our troopers up until the point that they have 5 years on. And then after you have 5 years on, I would say that the scrutiny gets even more intense. Thanks, Will.
Thank you, Colonel. I also, again, want to extend sincere thanks to our panel, but I also want to extend thanks to everybody who participated this evening, right? This conversation was robust because you guys joined, because you asked questions, and we were able to engage in some dialogue. But I want to urge us all that this is just a start, right? For some, this may have been our first conversation around policing the police, right? Or what law enforcement or what public safety looks like in our communities. For some of us, this has been just one conversation in a series of conversations over many, many years. But regardless of where we enter this conversation, it's important that we continue to have the conversation, and more important that we do the work to make sure that these things that we're talking about actually become reality, that we dismantle these systems that promote white supremacy and actually enhance systems that promote community and promote healing. And it's, you know, we're getting off of this election cycle, right? No matter where you were within that cycle, a lot of people put a lot of energy into it, right? We need to keep that same energy that we had for our election at a local level as well, right? So whether it's your city council, whether it's your school board, whether it's going to your local precincts meeting here in the city of Newark, whether it's going to the conversations that the state police are having or the AG are having, it's essential for us to keep that same energy that we had throughout all of this work, and specifically within our local communities. So again, thanks for everybody for participating this evening. And with that, I'm gonna actually throw it back over to Donna to close us out.
Thank you. Okay, and I get back my video. Thank you very much. Thank you, panel. You all were absolutely incredible. We appreciate how you were able to delve so deeply into these very important issues and sometimes very difficult issues. I think you brought a new way of us to think about, you know, how we engage with the police, but also how the community can be engaged in policing our own. So we appreciate that. We thank you, PSEG, for your support to enable us to be able to advance these dialogues. And Jelani, we thank you for giving us the product for us to be able to explore and unpack this. So audience, please continue to support our social justice initiatives. We meet every month. You can get the information on our website if you're not already receiving our regular emails. Every day this week, we have virtual programming at NJPAC. We have Newark Creators Program. We have dance workshops, virtual poetry workshops, you know, really keeping ourselves engaged as well as you. We invite you to join us. We look forward to seeing you also next month as we celebrate Kwanzaa. All 7 principles of Kwanzaa we'll be celebrating on December 19th. It's going to be extraordinary. So please join us for that as well. So as we heard from the panel tonight, let's take action where we are. That is the purpose of these conversations, for each of us to feel empowered. There's something I can do. I am not a victim. I am a proactive person, and you know, let's listen to where you can step in, where you feel confident to do that. And of course, visit us on our website. All of these dialogues and discussions are archived there. You can go back, refresh, look at our resource list and get information. And we look forward to seeing you very soon in the future. Thank you so much, everyone. Have a great night.